The sky over Kansas territory had turned the sickly green-gray color that every frontier settler learned to fear, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of violence. It was May 1883, and Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway of her small soddy watching the massive funnel cloud descend from the roiling clouds like the finger of an angry god reaching down to smite the earth. At 29, Sarah had already buried one husband and lost 2 children to fever. She had nothing left but the small homestead claim her late husband Thomas had filed 3 years earlier, and even that was mortgaged to the bank for more than it was worth. She should have been running for the root cellar, preparing to save herself from the approaching tornado. But years of loss had taught her that survival sometimes required more courage than self-preservation. That's when she saw him. A man on horseback, racing ahead of the storm, but clearly losing ground to the massive twister that was bearing down on the open prairie with terrifying speed. His horse stumbled, throwing him hard to the ground, and Sarah watched in horror as the animal scrambled to its feet and bolted, leaving its rider lying motionless in the dirt with the tornado advancing relentlessly toward him. Sarah didn't think. She simply ran, her skirts flying behind her as she sprinted across the dusty ground toward the fallen stranger. The wind was already picking up, throwing grit and small debris into her face, and the terrible roar of the approaching tornado filled her ears like the sound of 1,000 freight trains. The man was conscious but dazed when she reached him, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead where he'd struck his head in the fall. He was tall and well-built, dressed in clothes that marked him as a working cowboy rather than a drifter, but Sarah had no time to assess his situation beyond the immediate danger they both faced. "Can you walk?" she shouted over the growing roar of the wind. He tried to stand, but his left leg buckled beneath him. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ducked under his arm, taking as much of his weight as she could manage, and began half dragging him toward her soddy and the root cellar that might be their only chance of survival. The tornado was perhaps a quarter-mile away now, a massive column of debris-filled wind that seemed to devour everything in its path. Sarah's arms burned with the effort of supporting the injured stranger, and her lungs felt like they might burst from exertion and fear, but she kept moving, step by agonizing step, toward the safety of the underground shelter. They reached the soddy with perhaps a minute to spare. Sarah pulled open the heavy wooden door of the root cellar and helped the stranger down the steep stairs into the dark space below. She followed him down, pulling the door shut just as the tornado's full fury struck her small homestead. The sound was beyond description, a scream of wind and destruction that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. Sarah huddled in the darkness beside the stranger, feeling the walls of the root cellar shudder with each gust, praying that the thick earthen walls would hold against nature's assault. It lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the terrible roaring finally faded and the world above them grew quiet again, Sarah lit the lantern she kept in the cellar and turned to examine the man she had risked her life to save. In the lamplight, she could see that he was younger than she'd first thought, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair and strong features that were currently marked by pain and confusion. Blood had dried on the side of his face, and he was clearly struggling to focus his eyes properly. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse and strained. "You saved my life." "Don't thank me yet," Sarah replied practically, tearing a strip from her petticoat to clean the wound on his head. "We still need to see what's left up there and whether you can travel." "What's your name, James?" he said, wincing as she dabbed at the cut on his forehead. "James Thornton." "And you're Sarah Mitchell." "This was my homestead." She tried to keep the fear out of her voice, but she knew that tornado had likely destroyed everything she owned. "Hold still. This is going to need stitching, but I'll need better light than this lantern provides." They waited another hour before venturing above ground, giving the storm system time to fully pass and ensuring there were no follow-up tornadoes in the area. When Sarah finally pushed open the cellar door and climbed into the late afternoon sunlight, she had to blink back tears at what she saw. The tornado had cut a path directly through her property, destroying everything in its wake. Her soddy was completely gone, reduced to scattered chunks of earth and broken timber. The small barn where she'd kept her milk cow and 3 chickens had vanished entirely, leaving only the stone foundation. Her garden, which she had been counting on to help her survive the coming winter, was stripped bare, the topsoil scraped away by the tornado's force. "Oh, God," Sarah whispered, sinking to her knees in the destruction. Everything she had worked for, everything Thomas had died trying to build, was gone. Behind her, James emerged from the cellar, leaning heavily on the doorframe and surveying the devastation with obvious shock. "You're home," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry." Sarah struggled to compose herself, to push down the despair that threatened to overwhelm her completely. She had survived the tornado. That was something. She could rebuild. Somehow? "Your leg," she said, forcing herself to focus on immediate concerns rather than the overwhelming loss. "Can you put weight on it?" James took a tentative step and immediately grimaced with pain. "It's badly sprained, maybe broken. I won't be walking very far on it." Sarah looked around at the destruction, trying to formulate a plan. Her horse was gone, likely dead or fled far from the homestead. James's mount had bolted before the tornado struck. They were at least 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, and James couldn't walk. "There's a creek about half a mile from here," Sarah said, thinking aloud. "If I can fashion some kind of crutch for you, we might be able to make it there before dark. There's a grove of trees that would provide some shelter." "Mrs. Mitchell," James said, his voice strained with pain and something else, concern for her rather than himself. "You don't need to take care of me. You've already saved my life. If you can make it to the nearest homestead, you can send help back for me." Sarah looked at him incredulously. "I'm not leaving an injured man alone in the open with another storm system possibly on the way. We'll manage together or not at all." She found a broken timber that could serve as a makeshift crutch and helped James hobble toward the creek. The journey took nearly an hour, and by the time they reached the water and the relative shelter of the cottonwood trees, James was pale and sweating from pain and exertion. Sarah settled him on the driest ground she could find, then set about gathering fallen wood for a fire. She had matches in the pocket of her dress, one of the few possessions she had managed to save, and she soon had a small fire burning to ward off the evening chill. "You're remarkably capable." "Mrs. Mitchell," James said as she tended the fire, "not many women would have kept their heads in a situation like this. Not many women have buried a husband and 2 children before their 30th birthday," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "You learn to keep moving forward because the alternative is to lie down and die." James studied her in the firelight, seeing perhaps for the first time the strength and resilience that had allowed this woman to not only save his life but to continue functioning in the face of losing everything she owned. "Tell me about your husband," he said gently. Sarah poked at the fire, considering whether to share her story with this stranger. "Thomas filed this homestead claim 3 years ago. We'd been married 5 years, had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Then the fever came through the settlement. It took both children in the same week." Her voice remained steady, but James could see the pain in her eyes. "Thomas worked himself to death trying to prove up the claim and give me something to hold on to. He died last winter, and I've been trying to make it work on my own ever since. And now the tornado has taken what little you had left," James said softly. "Yes." Sarah looked up at the darkening sky, where stars were beginning to appear in the clear air that followed the storm. "I suppose I'll have to give up the claim now. There's no way I can rebuild without money or help." "Mrs. Mitchell," James began carefully, "there's something I need to tell you about who I am." Sarah looked at him curiously. "You're James Thornton, a cowboy who had very bad luck with his horse timing." "I'm James Thornton," he agreed, "but I'm not just a cowboy. I own the Triple T Ranch, along with several other properties in this county and the next. I'm what people call a cattle baron, though I prefer to think of myself as a working rancher who's been fortunate in business." Sarah stared at him, trying to process this information. "You're rich, very rich," James confirmed. And I owe you my life, Mrs. Mitchell. If you hadn't risked yourself to save me, I would have died in that tornado." "So what are you saying?" Sarah asked warily, unsure where this revelation was leading. "I'm saying that you saved the life of someone who has the resources to help you rebuild everything you've lost and more." "I'm saying that I want to repay the debt I owe you." Sarah felt a flicker of anger cut through her exhaustion and despair. "I didn't save you expecting payment, Mr. Thornton. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Because you were a human being in danger and I had the ability to help." "I know that," James said quickly. "That's exactly why I want to help you now. Because you acted selflessly, without any thought of personal gain, and people like that deserve to be rewarded rather than left to struggle." "I don't want charity," Sarah said firmly. "Good, because I'm not offering charity," James replied. "I'm offering partnership." Sarah looked at him skeptically. "What kind of partnership?" James shifted his injured leg carefully, clearly thinking through what he wanted to propose. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've been looking for someone to manage the domestic side of my ranch operations. Someone who can handle the household staff, manage supplies and accounts, and bring order to a place that's been run by cowboys and hired help for too long. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a position as ranch manager, with a substantial salary and a house on the property. In exchange, I would also like to help you rebuild on your homestead claim, so you maintain ownership of your own land even while working for me." Sarah processed this information, looking for the trap or the hidden obligation that would make this generous offer less appealing than it seemed. "Why would you do all that? Why not just offer me a job as a housekeeper? Because you're clearly capable of much more than basic housekeeping," James said honestly. "The way you handled the tornado, your calm under pressure, your ability to make quick decisions and take action, those are the qualities of a leader, not a servant. I need someone who can truly partner with me in running a large operation, and I think you might be exactly that person. And if I refuse, then I'll still help you rebuild your homestead. Because I owe you my life, and that's a debt that can't be repaid with mere money," James said. "But I hope you won't refuse because I think we could build something remarkable together." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire and trying to sort through her emotions. Pride warred with practicality. Fear of accepting help battled against the reality of her desperate situation. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," James agreed. "Though perhaps we could start with getting me to a doctor and both of us to some proper shelter. I believe my ranch headquarters is about 8 miles from here." Help arrived the next morning in the form of a search party from the Triple T Ranch, led by James's foreman, who had grown worried when his boss didn't return from his ride the previous day. Sarah watched in amazement as nearly a dozen ranch hands descended on their campsite with horses, supplies, and a wagon to transport James and his injured leg. The Triple T Ranch was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The main house was a sprawling structure of stone and timber, surrounded by numerous outbuildings, corrals, and what looked like a small village of bunkhouses and workshops. Cattle grazed as far as she could see, and the operation seemed to employ dozens of workers. "You weren't exaggerating when you said you were wealthy," Sarah murmured as the wagon approached the main house. James smiled slightly, though his face was still pale from pain and the difficult journey. "I try not to be ostentatious about it, but yes, I've been very fortunate in my business ventures." Over the following weeks, as James recovered from his injuries and Sarah adjusted to her new circumstances, she began to understand the full extent of what he had offered her. The position of ranch manager was not merely a courtesy title. James genuinely wanted her input on every aspect of the domestic operations, from menu planning to staff scheduling to procurement of supplies. More surprisingly, he treated her as an intellectual equal, seeking her opinion on business matters and actually listening when she offered suggestions. Sarah found herself gradually relaxing into her new role, discovering that she had a natural talent for organization and management that had never had an opportunity to flourish on a small, struggling homestead. "The supply contracts with the general store are inefficient," Sarah told James one evening as they reviewed the ranch accounts together in his office. You're paying premium prices for items that could be purchased directly from wholesalers in Kansas City for half the cost. James studied the figures she had compiled, clearly impressed by her analysis. You're absolutely right. Would you be willing to handle renegotiating those contracts? I'd be happy to, Sarah replied, feeling a surge of satisfaction at having her abilities recognized and valued. As spring turned to summer, Sarah threw herself into her new responsibilities with an energy and enthusiasm she hadn't felt since before Thomas's death. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a purpose beyond mere survival, like she was building something meaningful rather than just trying to hold on to the remnants of past dreams. But it was James's attention to her personal well-being that gradually transformed their professional relationship into something more complex and emotionally charged. True to his word, he had hired contractors to rebuild on her homestead claim, creating a small but comfortable house on the land she and Thomas had worked so hard to establish. He consulted her on every detail of the construction, ensuring that the new home reflected her preferences rather than his assumptions about what she might want. "Why are you doing all this?" Sarah asked him one evening as they reviewed the building plans. "You've already given me employment and security. Why spend so much time and money on a homestead I might never even live in?" James looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because you saved my life, Sarah. And because in the months since that tornado, you've become someone I deeply admire and care about. I want you to have options, to know that you're free to make choices about your future without financial pressure or obligation to me." Sarah felt her heart race at the emotion in his voice and the use of her first name rather than the formal address they had maintained until now. "James, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider staying here permanently," James replied. "Not as an employee, but as my wife and true partner in everything I'm trying to build." Sarah stared at him, shocked by the proposal, even though part of her had sensed the growing attraction between them. "You want to marry me? I want to marry you," James confirmed. "Not out of obligation or because I feel I owe you something, but because over these past months I've fallen in love with your strength, your intelligence, your compassion, and the way you approach every challenge with determined grace." "But I'm a widow with nothing to my name," Sarah protested, though her heart sang at his words. "You could marry anyone. Someone from a wealthy family, someone who brings property and connections to the marriage." "I don't want anyone," James said firmly, taking her hands in his. "I want you. I want the woman who risked her life to save a stranger in a tornado, who rebuilt her life from nothing multiple times, who turned my disorganized household into a efficiently run operation, and who makes me laugh with her dry observations about my cattle baron neighbors." Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked at this man who had somehow become the center of her world over the past few months. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started loving you that first night by the creek, when you wanted to send me for help, even though you were the one who was injured." When James kissed her, it was with the passion of a man who had discovered something precious beyond measure. And Sarah responded with the pent-up emotion of someone who had finally found a place and a person where she truly belonged. They were married in the autumn, in a ceremony that brought together everyone from the surrounding counties. Sarah wore a dress of deep burgundy silk that James had ordered from St. Louis, and she stood beside him with confidence and joy, knowing that this marriage was built on mutual respect, genuine love, and shared commitment to building something beautiful together. The story of the struggling widow who saved a stranger in a tornado and later discovered he owned half the county became part of local folklore. But for Sarah and James, it was simply the beginning of their story, a love that had been forged in crisis, strengthened through partnership, and cemented by the daily choice to value and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. Years later, when their children asked how their parents had met, Sarah would tell them about the tornado, the rescue, and the surprising discovery of James's wealth and position. But she always emphasized the same lesson, that true worth had nothing to do with money or property, and everything to do with character, courage, and the willingness to help others without thought of personal gain. "Your father," she would say, taught me that real partnership means giving each other the freedom to be fully ourselves while building something together that's stronger than either of us could create alone. And James would add, with love shining in his eyes, and your mother taught me that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or owned. They can only be freely given and gratefully received. Their marriage became a model for others in their community, proving that the strongest relationships were built not on rescue and obligation, but on mutual respect, shared values, and the recognition that true partnership meant celebrating each other's strengths while supporting each other through weaknesses. The homestead where Sarah had once struggled alone was eventually donated to establish a school for children from struggling families, ensuring that her and Thomas's dreams for that land would continue to bear fruit for generations to come. And the Triple T Ranch flourished under the joint management of Sarah and James, becoming known not just for its prosperity, but for its compassionate treatment of workers and its contributions to the broader community. In the end, that tornado that had seemed to destroy everything Sarah had worked for had actually swept her into a life far richer and more fulfilling than anything she had previously imagined possible, proving once again that sometimes our greatest blessings arrive disguised as our worst disasters. If this story of unexpected love, second chances, and partnerships built on mutual respect touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to be reminded that our acts of kindness often return to us in ways we never anticipated. Your support helps these stories reach others who may be walking through their own storms, showing them that sometimes when we reach out to help others without thought of reward, we discover that we've actually been helping ourselves find the way home. Thank you for believing in the transformative power of selfless action and the beautiful truth that the strongest love often grows from shared values and mutual respect rather than mere circumstance or obligation.